Hey, it's Imu, and we're back for more parallels between deception and revelation. We've seen connections between these stories tracing all the way up to the fifth command, Kabed et avicha ve'et imecha, and now we're off to explore the sixth command, Thou shalt not murder. But wait, dear Imu, you ask, perplexedly staring off into the middle distance. There is no murder in the deception story. Isaac, Rebekah, Jacob, and Esav, they all make it out alive. How can there possibly be connections between the deception story and the sixth command? Well, we're going to jump right into that question and eventually commandments 7 and 8 as we go through this episode. Join us. From Aleph Beta, this is a book like no other, generously sponsored by Shari and Nathan Lindenbaum.
Okay, Imu, so we're moving over to the second tablet there, do not murder. And what we're doing is kind of going through Genesis 27, moving on into Genesis 28, the Yaakov and Esav story writ large. We're looking at it in order. And Imu, where do we get something that reminds you of do not murder in our stories? Somewhere after the deception, after Rivka says to Yaakov in confidence, I'd like to send you away until your brother's wrath abates. And then we had that moment of Kibud Avaim, where Esav and Yaakov seem to abide by their parents' wishes in different ways. And what do you say? Do you have do not murder there anywhere?
So what's interesting is I would have said, if without proceeding in order, I would have said, Esav has the designs to murder his brother, but that takes place before Rivka has this idea to send him away. In fact, it's the overhearing of that plan that causes her to send him away.
Yep.
So that's not the murder. I can't really see a murder, but I can see a lo tirtzach if I'm looking for that. I can see not someone trying to murder, but someone actually not murdering, right? So
restraining themselves from murder.
Right. So what's fascinating is Esav wants, especially in the way in which we culturally most understand Esav, is this murderous, vengeful guy, ends up doing the surprising thing and not murdering his brother. And not just for a week or two, right? Like, I think if you're Eisav and you really want to kill Yaakov, okay, so he's not here, looking around Canaan, I can't find him anywhere. But after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, you probably know where he ended up.
Well, let's actually be really clear about it. Let's actually dive deep for a moment and look at the last thing we saw. The very last thing we saw was what we argued was a kibbud av v'em moment, a moment when Yaakov and Esav honor, in effect, both their mother and their father. Now, what Yaakov does is Vayishma Yaakov el aviv el imo. Yaakov listens to both his mother and his father and goes to Haran to go find a wife in obedience to their commands. But what does Esav do? Vayar Esav kirot berot Canaan b'nei Yitzchak. Esav overhears all this, sees that his parents are not into the wives coming from Canaan, and tries to make amends and marry a wife from the family, just like Yaakov was instructed to by his parents. But if you look a little bit in a little bit of a larger sense, we might say that there's another overarching act of kibbud av v'em that Esav does at this moment. Because what's really interesting, and we mentioned this before, is that the text doesn't just tell us Vayishma Yaakov el aviv el imo as a narrator. It's not just the narrator comes along in the text at some point and says, oh, by the way, when Rivka and Yitzchak told Yaakov to leave, you should know Yaakov listened to him and left. No, Vayishma Yaakov el aviv el imo is a parenthetical inclusion to something larger that's happening.
Of all the things that Esav saw.
It's all the things that Esav heard, right? The very beginning of that sentence, so to speak, is Vayar Esav ki, and Esav saw that. What did he see? He saw that, A, Yitzchak blessed Yaakov, B, that he sent him to Padan Aram to get a wife, C, that he commanded not to him and said, don't take a wife from Canaan, and D, he saw that Yaakov listened to his mother and his father, and he in fact went to Padan Aram. Now, if that's true, if it's not just the narrator saying that Yaakov listened to his mother and his father, but it is the narrator telling us that Esav overheard all of this, overheard the instructions of exactly where Yaakov was going, and overheard the fact that Yaakov in fact went there. And it's the case that Esav was
That's a good
really
point.
mad and was really mad and wanted to kill his brother. What do you think
That's a good
Esav
point.
should have done next?
It literally says that Esav overheard where Yaakov went. He
Yeah,
knew where Yaakov was. It's not a matter of investigation. Just say this super clear. If Esav is overhearing mom and dad say, hey, Yaakov, go to Lavan's house to get a kid, then guess what he
that's
knows
it.
about Yaakov's location?
Exactly.
He's got,
He's running away to be safe from Esav. But unfortunately, guess who overhears the runaway plot? The
yeah, it's
potential
Esav.
murderer.
Yeah.
So why doesn't he just go and kill him? He has the motive. And Beth, our one of us scholars at Aleph Beta, really made this point. I think in one of the videos she did on this topic, that he has the motive, he has the capability. Right? Yaakov is running away on the lam, penniless, unprotected. This is the moment that Esav could make good on that desire for vengeance. Now, remember, it's interesting. Esav never verbalizes the desire for vengeance as much as we know. The text tells us, Vayomer Esav bilibo. Esav says in his heart, Yikru v'yimei evil, soon my father will die and I'll be able to kill Yaakov. But Esav has the choice of whether to take that inner state of, oh my gosh, I'd really like to kill my brother, and translate that into actual actions. And he doesn't do it. And you have to ask why. And I think, and really, I think this is the argument Beth was making. This really is the ultimate kibbud av v'em from Esav, right? It's not just that he saw Ra'ot Benot Canaan, that the women of Canaan were not pleasing to his parents. That's part of the act of kibbud av v'em here. But right at that moment that he saw that Yaakov listened to his father and his mother, in a way, so did Esav. Because Esav now has the perfect chance to kill him, but he won't. And the question is, why? Why won't he? If he says, if he's out to get his brother, and the answer would be, I can't do it to my father. Can't do it to my father. And therefore, that in essence is not only an act of kibbud av v'em, it's also an act of refraining yourself from murder. It's an act of abiding by the basic imperative of lo tirtzach.
That's beautiful. And that's really interesting about murder. It reminds me actually of what you taught back in the Ten Commandments days, which is a person who wants to murder someone, right? Why do you want to kill someone else? Somehow you don't feel like, this earth is big enough for the both of us. Like you need to eliminate them because you find their very presence threatening.
Mhm.
Why does Esav find Yaakov's presence on this earth threatening? And what we've been
Because it
learning is it's
reminds
not.
of what his father did. Yeah.
Yeah, it's about dad. And so here is this delicious like present that he overhears, which is you can finally get what you've always wanted. Kill, this guy who's been an impediment for you. But Esav hears the deeper thing that he could possibly get. He actually hears father's values, and after all of it, he decides to try again to earn father's love instead of taking out the competition. That is, I don't know. My mind is reeling both because of number one, what it tells us about the relationships here between hatred of brother and father. Number two, because of what it tells us, I think about murder, possibly about like how whenever you try to kill someone, you're not really going to get what you want. It's probably about something else. And then I think the third thing is, and this has less to do with the pattern of what we've been doing in this course so far, but just I'm moved by it. The third thing that I feel is, I don't know, Esav, like, wow, look at that self-control. Look at that
Yeah. In other words,
choice
here's
that he
here's this
makes.
person who is angry at his brother, and in fact is just really angry at his father, but doesn't want to be angry at his father, so he's angry at his brother. And here's this perfect chance to get rid of that brother and to somehow get some respite for that burning, unresolved anger, getting jilted for this blessing, which is really an anger at father. And ironically, what is it that holds himself back from doing that? It's this sense that, I may be upset. I may be really upset, but how could I do this to my father? He's ultimately Yaakov, a child of this father and is loved by father. He just got this blessing. I just can't do this. And I wonder, Imu, if these connections are telling us something profound about Lo Tirtzach. We would imagine that a guy like Esav, somebody who could consider murder, would just look at what's happening and say, I have the location. I'm ready to murder in a cold-hearted kind of way. And I think that's how we all view murderers. Murder is like this terrible thing that no person
Right.
in his right mind would ever consider doing. And you have to be an evil person rubbing your hands together in glee and a cartoonish villain in order to
Right.
consider murder. But the fact is that's not true. Real people murder. And what the Torah seems to be suggesting is it's kind of understandable why people would sometimes want to murder. I mean, put yourself in Esau's shoes. Right? It may not be justified, but you can sort of understand where he's coming from. I mean, he's really, really angry. He got jilted out of this blessing. His father said, "Go hunt this game," and then he's really angry at his father. He's displacing that anger on his brother. He thinks that if he could just get rid of his brother, it's this fantasy that everything would be okay. And the Torah's response to that, in a way, when it's telling us all to avoid murder, I think is almost its way of saying, hey, God, I kind of get it. I get it why you human beings might want to kill people. I understand that things can go so badly in your life that you can feel so jilted, so forlorn, so depressed that you could give into this illusion that if only that person were not there in this world, all my problems would be better. They wouldn't actually be better, but you could give into that illusion. I understand. And you know why you're not going to murder? In the end, maybe we all have to ask ourselves to do what Esav did, which is you don't murder because of kibud av va'em. The same way Esav didn't murder because Yaakov was the child of someone. He was the child of a parent, and that parent was the same parent to Esav as he was to Yaakov. And I say, how could I do this to my parent? I can't do that to him. In a way, because we're all created with a divine spark, we're all the children of God. And I wonder if that's what we call upon when we feel like things would just be so much better if I could just get rid of that person. Everything would be better. Why don't we? God is saying, I get it. I understand your feeling, but realize that both you and the person that you seek to murder are children of the same parent in heaven. How could you do it to that parent? How could you do it to me? You know how terrible I would feel if one of my creations would kill another of my creations, one of my children would kill another of my children. It's a father's worst nightmare that one child would kill another. That's what you're doing if you kill. Hold yourself back the same way Esav held yourself back, and
Oh, that's
call upon
fascinating.
kibud av va'em as the spiritual ammunition that you use to be able to refrain from murder. It's a fascinating jump between the two sides of the Ten Commandments, between the two tablets. I'm using the energy of the last command on the first tablet to power the ability to refrain from the great crime at the top of the next tablet.
That's
Don't
beautiful.
murder. Let's move on to the next command.
All right, the next command, lo tinaf, do not commit adultery. And thinking about the deception story for a moment, there is no adultery. So there you go. Just like there was no murder in the deception, and that was our link to lo tirtzach, since there is no adultery, that must be our link to lo tinaf. Connection found, case closed. Thanks for listening. See you next time. No, I'm just kidding. In this case, there is more going on here. But I'll be honest, because of the absence of overt adultery, we almost question whether the parallels really did continue. But as you'll see in our conversation, Rabbi Fohrman wanted to show me that there was something adultery-like in the Jacob story that grabbed his attention. And to explore this possibility, he wanted to take me past Jacob running away, past the famous story of the dream with the ladder, and into what happens to Jacob next. That's where the Torah seemed to be planting some seeds of connection to the seventh command, planted in Jacob's stay in the house of Lavan.
Commandment number 7, lo tinaf. Lo tinaf, of course, means don't commit adultery. It's the interposition of somebody that does not belong in a sacred, intimate relationship between a man and a woman that we know as marriage. Does anything like that happen later on in the story?
Yeah, so my first instinct is like if adultery is related to marriage and to, I guess, messing with a marriage, there's definitely somebody who messes with a marriage, because right after Yaakov gets to Lavan's house, right after he's there for a bit, he engages in a contract to marry Lavan's daughter. And that contract doesn't go as expected. Is that where you...
That's sort of where I was going. Things don't go according to plan. What happens?
Yaakov makes an agreement to marry Rachel. He says he's going to work for his father-in-law for 7 years. And it seems like 7 years later, we're at the wedding night, and lo and behold, Yaakov wakes up with Leah, Rachel's older sister.
That's right. So now, technically, I don't know if you would call that adultery. I mean, it's not quite adultery, but it's adulterous-like, right? There's an adulterous-like moment there when someone spends the night with somebody who, isn't their spouse, right? And that is adultery-like.
It's interesting to figure out who the adulterer is and who all the victims are.
Right, because you wouldn't sort of look at Yaakov and say, you've committed adultery. I mean, like, he doesn't.
Right, because you can't say in that situation where Yaakov is the perpetrator, right? Like, he seems to be innocent, right?
Right, and it's no fault of his. He's just completely in the dark, right, about it. Now, even though he is completely in the dark and has no idea what's going on, though, I mean, if you think about it from Rachel and Leah's standpoint, right, the feelings that we would associate with adultery, one might imagine speculatively could be there. But if you think about the moment of the night itself, right, could you imagine, here you are, Rachel, and, this is the night you've been waiting for 7 years, and you're stuck in the attic waiting to come down in your white dress, and no one ever calls you, and you hear sounds of joy erupt, and it suddenly dawns on you that this is your sister getting married, and it's not to the husband of your dreams, and it's not you. What does that feel like to be usurped in that way? But even like if you switch and look over to Leah, what does it feel like to be Leah? It can't feel wonderful. I mean, like literally, if you could imagine what it would be like to wake up in the morning and have your husband discover who you are, or even, being intimate with this man who thinks that you're not you and thinks that you're someone else. Whatever it is that he, whispers in your ear wasn't really meant for you. It was meant for someone else. These are anguished moments. And it recalls, I don't know.
What we're going with this is really fascinating, actually, because my mind is leaping to this. It's almost like if you're going to be really algebraic here and look for lo tinaf, I don't see it in the story, right? There is no adultery. There's no like marriage and then, Yaakov goes and sleeps with someone else, or, Rachel goes and sleeps with someone else, or, Yaakov's best friend. That doesn't happen. Right. But what I hear you saying is almost like look for the consequence of the crime without the crime itself.
Right.
Because what is the consequence of adultery? Well, how do you feel when you get cheated on, right? You may feel excluded. You may feel rejected. You may feel shame. And what I hear you saying is like, let's look at each of the players here. Is it possible that they all almost feel cheated on?
And the tragedy in the story is that everyone is innocent. Rachel is innocent. She didn't do this. Leah is innocent. She didn't do this. Yaakov is innocent. He got tricked. There's only one villain in this story. And the villain is father-in-law or father. It's Lavan. And you think Lavan, if he's the villain, is he the adulterer? I mean, he's not the adulterer. But in some weird way, if you get to the essence of what adultery is, not the physical act of adultery, but the idea of adultery. Adultery is interposing yourself in somebody else's intimate relationship. I mean, that's what Lavan did, right? I mean, Lavan went and messed with Yaakov's intimate relationship with the one that he wanted to marry, with Rachel. And, is he the adulterer when the Torah comes and says, lo tin'af, right? Do not commit adultery. In some way, is that sort of pointing the finger at Lavan and saying, you messed with somebody else's intimate relationship? Now, Imu, if it was just you and me sitting around chatting about this, and you would ask me, well, Fohrman, what's your degree of confidence that when the Torah says lo tin'af, right, it kind of has in mind Lavan, right? Because, look, it's right where you would expect it to be. It follows six commandments. It is a marriage that gets interposed, right? But this idea that Lavan's the adulterer seems like a stretch. You tell me, give me an odds where 0 is like, oh no, for sure that's a coincidence, and 10 and 100 is like, oh, for sure the Torah is talking about Lavan there when it's with lo tin'af. What would you say?
It's definitely not 100. And I would say, for me, what's frustrating about this command versus others is that you'd want the corner pieces, you'd want the evidence to be in the command itself, whereas this is almost entirely contextual. The word lo tin'af or tin'af does not appear, even though lo tirtzach didn't exactly appear. You have a murder, right? You have I'm going to murder you, and then he doesn't murder. So that's pretty good. But the fact that we have to rely entirely on context clues, right? The fact that, we see the other commands and we see them in order, and this is the only place it has to be. The closest I can get to an adultery is a marriage. And what do you know? That marriage goes wrong. So now I have to look and force myself to say, okay, it's gotta, I feel pretty confident that the Torah is nudging us to this marriage and saying adultery. And now we have to say, in what way?
But if you, right, so you're pretty confident, but you're like a 60, you're like a 70% confident. If you wanted to be super confident, you'd say okay, I'm hearing the thematic echoes. I'm just not seeing it in text. All the other things were text. Show it to me where in the text,
the
Torah
know,
is
right?
Pointing the finger of lo tin'af. So Imu, here's the thing. How many times do you think lo tin'af, right, the notion of niyuf, referring to adultery, how often does that appear in the Torah? You got it in the 10 Commandments. Besides the 10 Commandments, do you know where else it appears? It appears only one other time. Leviticus 20:10, the only other time, I think. By the way, it's not clear what exactly that means. We translate it as adultery, but it's not so obvious. How do you know it means adultery? The answer is you know it because it appears elsewhere in the Torah, and there it means adultery. The context is clear. Imu, go to 20:10 in Leviticus, and let's just read it over here. And as you read it, ask yourself, is the Torah slyly making a reference to Lavan here? Let's read it and see.
Okay. So the context of where we are in 20 is this is arayos, the list of forbidden relationships. And in verse 10, it says, V'ish asher yin'af et eshes ish, and a man who does niyuf, which we understand as adultery, with the wife of another man, asher yin'af et eshed re'ehu, they are committing adultery with the wife of not just a man, but of his neighbor, of his friend. Mot yumat hanoef hanoefes. The noef and the noefes, the two parties to adultery, shall be put to death.
Okay, great. The context sort of makes clear that it's talking about adultery. We see that it's someone messing with someone else's wife, not just someone else's wife, with his friend's wife. And you say, okay, well, that's kind of interesting. But that language, asher yinaf et eshed re'ehu, ask yourself, where in the Torah do I have ish and re'ehu together? And the answer is... Well, that's true, but it's not in the Torah. You have it, mishlach manot, ish l're'ehu, right? Okay. We've got that in Esther, right? But back in the Torah, do we have it? Earlier than Vayikra, where else do we have ish and re'ehu? The answer is we have it in the story of Yaakov and Lavan. When Yaakov eventually absconds and leaves Lavan's household. So there's this moment when Lavan catches up with him. They have this showdown, and then Lavan decides it would be a great idea for them to have this pile of stones that's going to be a witness, gal aid. Imu, come with me to Genesis 31, verse 49, and read that for me.
Okay. V'hamitzpah asher amar yitzef Hashem beini uveinacha. he says God should watch between us. Ki nisater ish mi re'ehu. Oh, there you go. Because each one of us will be hidden from one another. So basically, they create this monument where they say, the witness for our covenant is going to be God. God's going to watch over both of us because each of us will be hidden from one another.
And what is Lavan worried about at this point? He says, I'm really worried because I'm not going to be able to see you. Ish and Re'ehu are going to part. I'm Ish, you're the Re'ehu. We're going to part from each other. And who knows what you're going to do when I'm not around. That's why we have to have this stone witness. You might even do the following. Read the next verse.
Verse 50 says, Im ta'aneh et bnotai, if you oppress my daughters, v'im tikach nashim al bnotai, you might take some additional wives. Ein ish imanu. It'll be like there's no man between us.
Any shimanu, there won't be anyone to tell you not to do it.
Okay,
right?
Yeah, when there is no man there.
When there is no man there, so how am I supposed to know you aren't going to do that? Re'eh Elokim aid. God's going to be your witness, between you and me, because I'm not going to be around to stop you. And this would be the cardinal sin. I am so concerned with my daughter's welfare. God forbid, the worst thing that could happen to a girl is she thinks she's in a marriage with her beloved, and all of a sudden he marries somebody else. That would be awful if you did such a thing, that terrible crime. Well, of course, who's guilty of that crime? Who's guilty of already doing that?
Lavan.
It's exactly what Lavan did to Rachel. So Lavan is being disingenuous. Lavan is being hypocritical. He is the one who is guilty of this. But listen to this language now. Ish and Re'ehu. Lavan is the Ish. Yaakov is the Re'ehu. And now, with that in mind, read Vayikra 20:10 one more time.
Yeah, so it says the Ish, like if you take the same Ish from back in Genesis.
That would be who?
It would be Lavan.
Yep.
Ish asher yinaf es eshes ish. Right, a person who adulterifies the wife of another man. This man would be Yaakov. How do we know? Because the text actually gives you a definition. Asher yinaf et eshet re'ehu, who adulterifies the wife of his neighbor.
It's almost as if Vayikra is using Yaakov and Lavan language to describe our classical case of adultery. Now, Imu, the evidence here is not any one word. It's the confluence of three things together. The word ish, it appears all over the place in the Torah. The word re'ehu, it appears all over the place in the Torah. Even ish and re'ehu appear all over the place in the Torah. But there's only two places that ish and re'ehu appear together in a particular context, in the context of interposing yourself in someone else's marriage. That is the context in which it appears in Genesis. The only other time you have that language is the Torah's description of what niyuf is. Ish asher yinaf et eshet re'ehu, a man that performs adultery, that gets involved in someone else's marriage, messing with his intimate relationships. And just in case you weren't sure, right, who is the woman, Imu, who would be the victim in the Yaakov and Lavan adultery, the main victim, right? Who is Yaakov supposed to be with that night?
He's supposed to be with Rachel.
And what is Rachel always called, as opposed to Leah, when it comes to the wives of Yaakov? Go back to Vayikra 20:10 again. Ish asher yinaf et eshet ish. That language, eshet, is specifically the language the Torah uses, strangely enough, to characterize Yaakov's relationship with Rachel, but Rachel only, not Leah. For example, remember that poignant moment where Yehuda is finally telling that masked Egyptian official, who's really his long-lost brother Yosef, the whole story of Yaakov and the whole story of the children of Leah. And he says,
this is Shnai Yalduli Ishti.
That's right. My father said to us that back when we were in Canaan, Atem Yadatem, Ki Shnayim Yaldali Ishti, that my wife only gave birth to two, and one of them is gone, and the end never seen from again. And what if I lose Binyamin? I mean, if you're Yehuda, how painful is it to hear my wife only gave birth to two children, right? Who's being
terribly painful
here?
Because he's right. He doesn't. It's not true. Your wife didn't have two kids. You have a few wives, and you have 12. But if you only think that one of those women is your wife and the rest are not, then that's true. Then Shnaim Yalduli Ishti. So Yaakov is saying it, and Yehuda is saying it, and the Torah is saying it. So in the formula here, if there's a man that is interfering and with the wife of of your friend and of your friend, then that's going to gives you all the variables we were looking for. We were looking for who is the perpetrator,
who's the wife,
and who's
Eshet,
the victim.
that specific Eshet is Rachel. The usurper is Leah, and the grand usurper is Lavan, who put you up to it. You see it again, by the way, at the very end of his life. Yaakov, on his deathbed, is talking about how he desperately wants to be buried in Marat Machpelah. Shama kavru et Avram, he says in Genesis 49:31. That's where Avram buried Sarah Ishto. That's where he buried Sarah, his wife. There's that word Eshet. Shama kavru et Yitzchak vet Rivka Ishto. That's where they buried Yitzchak and Rivka Ishto, his wife. V'shama, and there, kavarti, I buried Leah. What word is missing?
Oh, wow. It doesn't even describe her relationship to him. It doesn't say it's his wife.
Yeah.
Tragic, but great for us in our evidence, right? Really clear.
In other words, the way Yaakov is perceiving it is that Leah was an interposition. He was always supposed to marry Rachel. Rachel was the woman of his dreams, right? And, you can argue with Yaakov and you could say it shouldn't be that way and he should have made peace with it or something like that. But it's Yaakov's perception that Leah came and was just interfered in this relationship between him and Rachel. And it's not Leah's fault, but if you would say who is the actual agent who interfered, it's very clearly Lavan, and that's what Vayikra 20:10 is telling you. Ish asher yinaf et eshet ish. When a man comes along and interposes in a relationship with someone else's eshetz, with someone else's Rachel, someone interposes between the wife of his Re'ehu. Well, here is Lavan with his self-righteousness saying, Kini sater ish mere'ehu. God should be our witness when one of us goes and is no longer seen by Re'ehu. And it would be terrible because what then if you would take any other woman and make my daughters feel unloved? Well, of course, he's the one who did that. And the proof that he's the one who did that is Vayikra 20:10. Ish asher yinaf et eshet. The Torah specifically uses Lavan's language, and he calls upon God to be witness. It's almost like God is saying, well, I'm your witness now. The witness is going to testify in Vayikra 20:10. I, God, is going to set this straight. Lavan, you were the guy who did this. You were the guy who interposed and who used Leah as a tool to interfere between Yaakov and Rachel. You are the one who's guilty of the spirit of Niyuf, the spirit of adultery.
Okay, so taking stock of everything we've explored so far in terms of connections between the command against adultery and the Yaakov and Lavan story, I still think that the strongest piece of evidence is just the context. The marriage between Yaakov, Rachel, and Leah is clearly the only marriage in this story. And it certainly appears that all of them suffered in the same way as one would suffer in a traditional case of adultery. What's surprising is that Lavan is in the role of the quote-unquote adulterer. And I think that the textual connections of Ish, Re'ehu, and Eshet to Lo Tinaf, they really support this claim. It definitely made me feel more confident in this connection and in identifying Lavan as the perpetrator of the adultery. I think that you showing me this additional piece, is it defines who are the bad actors, right? Because if we have to look in the story, we're looking for who cheated on whom. Well, Yaakov slept with the wrong woman, right? So then that would tell you that Yaakov is the adulterer. But if you read the variables that are defined in Leviticus 20, it tells you who is the perpetrator and who is the victim. And something really surprising emerges, which is that the Torah's paradigmatic case for adultery isn't even a guy who cheats on his wife with someone else, right? Or a gal who cheats on her husband with someone else. It's the paradigmatic case is a father-in-law interfering with his daughter's marriage. And that goes back to, I think, something we were saying earlier, which is if you hunt for the crime, it's harder to find. But if you hunt for the outcome, the Torah is telling you almost like the paradigmatic outcome case, right? Feeling betrayed, right? And feeling excluded. It almost heightens the betrayal. And it doesn't almost, it heightens the betrayal that if you get cheated on with, random lady at the bar, right? Versus with your own sister. That is terrible, way worse.
And if your father puts them up to that.
Right, exactly.
Unknowingly.
So it's all your most intimate relationships are dissolving at the same time, not just with husband, but with sister and with father, right? That is the ultimate betrayal. That shows me, it totally changes the nature of this crime and helps us understand
go ahead.
No, it helps us understand the crime so much more than if you just see it as adultery. Actually, it's the dissolution, it's the betrayal of the most intimate relationships.
Yeah, right. It's someone else getting involved when they completely shouldn't be involved. You kind of see it with a couple other hat tips with Lavan. Right in the very beginning of Yaakov's relationship with Lavan, and Yaakov says, I want to marry Rachel. I want to work with her for 7 years. Lavan's language, slyly, is, well, ach atzmi ubasari ata. You are, after all, my own flesh and blood. Hang out for a while. Let's see how it goes. And that language, atzmi ubasari ata, that's very, very redolent. That language evokes something very, very intimate. Who is the one who is atzmi ubasari ata imu in the Torah's language?
When Adam wakes up from God's sleep where he makes Eve, he wakes up and says, oh, this woman should be my marriage partner because, after all, she is etzem basari basari, bone and flesh.
And so when Lavan says, well, just stay here for a while, you want Rachel, but ach atzmi b'sariata, you are, after all, my own flesh and blood. It's almost as this is terrible foreshadowing, which is that you might want my daughter, but I'm going to deal with you as if you were my own beloved, as if I could have you for myself. And when he uses Leah as a tool to ruin that first relationship between Yaakov and Rachel, it's almost as if Lavan is saying, see, I was always the one who is going to be the owner of that relationship, not you and Rachel. It's going to be me.
It's doubly damning because it seems really creepy for someone outside of a marital relationship to use, that bone and flesh language, which is reserved for marital relationships. So Lavan saying it about Yaakov feels really weird. But what's doubly weird is that in the original context, it says, Al kain ya'azov Adam et aviv et imo v'tavak be'ishto. It says, this is the reason why a man should leave behind his parents and cling to his wife, because they are, flesh and bone. They're of one with each other. So you're going to leave behind one singularity, the singularity with your family, with your parents, to create a new singularity, right, with your spouse. So what's shocking here is that the parent isn't letting their child go to create the new singularity. He's not letting his child break off and start a new relationship. He's holding them close. And Beth made this argument, I believe, in the Meaningful Judaism Nida piece. But she even argued that the reason why Lavan says to Yaakov, Tov titi otach mititi li'ish acher, better I give her to you than to another man, is possibly because this was the issue he was facing. If he were to give her to another man who had the money to take her away and to leave, then he'd be losing his daughter right away. Better to give her to Yaakov, who is family and therefore will hang out, and penniless, so that he doesn't have to lose his daughter even though she's getting married, right? He can still hold on to daughter and not do the first thing father-in-law needs to do, which is bless your child and let them go so they can start this new life.
And what better way to get in the way of someone starting a new life with your daughter than to kind of rain on that relationship in the deepest, most pernicious way in the beginning, to kind of say, really dad is the only one you really want in your life. What do you really see in this husband anyway? All there is betrayal all around. And if you destroy the strength of that relationship from the beginning, then maybe dad feels like, nobody ever left me anyway. All of my kids are right here with each other because they're unhappy with each other. And what kind of relationship is there even really between man and wife? It's a very dark read of Lavan, but very believable too, especially in light of the fact that, Imu, if you keep on on reading that verse, Al Kain Ya'azav Ish et Aviv et Imo, that that's why a man leaves behind his mother and his father when he says, Zot hapam etzem matamai basar mibsari, when he intuits that his wife is a bone from my bone, flesh from my flesh. That's why he leaves behind his mother and his father. What's the very next words?
V'davak.
V'davak be'ishto. And he'll cling to his wife. And lo and behold, that word also appears with Lavan. When Lavan finally catches up with Yaakov running away, finally Yaakov has left behind mother and father. It took him many years. It took him 20 years, but he's finally left Lavan, and he's going to build his own life. And Lavan is back in the language, Vayad Beikota Bahar Gilad, and he caught up with him. But how do you translate Vayad Beik? He clings to him with that language that the Torah uses to describe how a man clings to his wife and is one with her when he leaves behind his parents. Lavan is like, no, you're not leaving behind anyone.
That's super elegant that when, son-in-law and daughter are trying to leave behind father is now going to use that language again and cling. It's really interesting. Wouldn't it be so much more elegant if just from a scholarship perspective, if the evidence of etzem metamai and basar mibsari and davak were all together in the same chapter? They weren't split apart by a bunch of chapters. But it is actually kind of interesting because you get the vibe that Lavan brings in Yaakov in etzem metamai and basar mibsari and doesn't let him go with davak, right? Like you get this feeling.
It's 20 years later, but this is the moment that he's finally going, and Lavan says, no, you're not going. You think you're clinging to her, you're clinging to me.
Right when he tries to leave. So what's interesting also that I'm seeing from all of this is if I had to ask you what was the act of adultery, right? You might think that it was the switching of the girls of the daughters.
Yeah.
And I'm that is part of the adultery. But the vibe I'm getting from all the evidence is it's the entire 20-year period, right? The entire 20-year period of interference, of never letting them go, of never giving them, the
space.
The space. And that's what Yaakov actually says to Lavan in their fight later on, right? When at that moment of confrontation, he says, for 20 years, I, performed for you. And I believe he says the words, vatidad shnati meinai, right? Like
I never slept.
I never slept. And I wonder if there's a double entendre there. Right, a double entendre of like I was working so hard for you, but I also never got to sleep with my wife. I never really, and obviously he did, but you were so in my marriage that I never was able to be with my wife. And I don't know if there is another vatidad shnati me'enai kind of connection in Tanakh, which is in Esther. Of all places, where the king can't sleep. Balayla hahu nadadash nat hamelech. And according to you in your Queen You Thought You Knew book, right, there's a reason why the king can't sleep that night. You know what he's thinking about?
Adultery.
He's thinking about adultery. He thinks that his wife is, sleeping with Haman or conspiring or whatever, involved with Haman. So these two cases would be cases where someone else is interfering in a marriage. But what's interesting to me is that it's not just describing the switch, it's describing the 20-year period.
In other words, there's a lasting legacy for Lavan's interference in that relationship by inserting Leah where she doesn't belong. Lavan has made his mark on that relationship, and inasmuch as he continues to have them under his foot, that mark continues to persist, continue to sort of leach love and connection from the relationship between Yaakov and his wives. And, not for now, Imu, because this isn't really a treatment of the Yaakov, Rachel, and Leah stories in and of itself. It's really a more global treatment of the Ten Commandments. But for those of you who want to follow this thread further, I'd really encourage you to take a look at our video, Rachel's Tears. It's one of our most popular videos on Aleph Beta. If you haven't seen it yet, the sort of climax of that video, Imu, is that there's this moment of renaissance in the marriage of Yaakov and his wives, when it's almost like they replay that first marital night, and somehow there's a reconciliation between Rachel and Leah on the one hand, and between Yaakov and his wives on the other hand. And it all has to do with this almost ceremonial replaying of that first night without Lavan's treachery. It's almost a way of getting the adulterer out of the relationship. And it's like, we can do this again, but we can do it without him. And once that happens, there's kind of a renewal of love between all involved in a way that just wasn't possible in the aftermath of that kind of deception and switch without it somehow being addressed. And Rachel and Leah, to their credit, seem to find a way to address it in the story of the Dudaim.
Yeah, that was a beautiful, beautiful course, and teaches you something about almost like the inverse of the crime, right? If the crime is about exclusion, about betrayal, about the shattering of intimate relationships, right? That course is all about the repairing of all of those things, about inclusion, about empathy.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, adultery halachically might just be this case of a man being intimate with someone else's wife. But in the Torah's using of a paradigmatic example of that as a father using someone else to interfere in a relationship in his own daughter's marriage. It's like, boy, you know, what is actually problematic in their marriages, short of adultery, parental interference in ways where the parent is like, well, I'm just sort of doing my job. I'm just trying to keep my kids close. And that's what Lavan would have told you if you interviewed Lavan. It's like, well, what do you want? Of course, Tov Titio tells me to use it. Of course, I'd rather give it to you than someone else. I want someone to cart away and take away my daughter, right? But it's sort of like this, almost this Musar Haskell, this sort of searching question that every parent has to ask, which is like, why is it so important that your kids live so close to you? Like, where exactly is that coming from? And can you overstep that bound into illegitimate interfering in your kids' relationship? You know, it's this dance. It's almost like when a man and a woman come into a new relationship, it's almost like there's this cocoon effect where you go into this cocoon, you leave behind the past, and you create this new unity. And then this new unified being called man and woman together can reestablish their relationships with all of those who are important around them, and who's more important than with parents, right? But if parents get in the way of the formation of that bond, right? If parents don't give them that space, in a way, isn't it fascinating that becomes, that an egregious example of that becomes a version of adultery, of a kind of the energy of adultery in the Torah? It's very mind-boggling, but that seems to be the case.
Yeah, I think that what's also kind of interesting is the motivation then of the adulterer in this case, because Lavan and fathers-in-law in general can all make the case that they're just doing what's best for their daughters, right? They love their daughters. So the fact that you can hurt them by loving them too much is really fascinating. And that is kind of the adultery crime, right? You can basically argue.
When Lavan basically says to Yaakov in anguish at the end of all this, when he finally catches up with him with that illegitimate word, vayad bake, he says, you ran away and you didn't even give me a chance to kiss my daughters goodbye, to kiss my grandchildren. I would have sent you away with a brass band if only you had given me the chance. And there is some truth to that. There is love at the heart of Lavan. In his mind, all he's doing is trying to love his kids and his grandkids. But the Torah's cautionary tale is what a non-self-aware person can do, how destructive that love can be when it's applied too much, and in times when it's not the time for it. You can literally be guilty of interfering in someone else's love.
So what's fascinating about that to me is carry that back over to classic adultery. It too, if you look at the motivation of the adulterer, you can also defend him, if you like, as a crime of love. Like, what do you want from me? I'm not.
I saw this girl. She was so distressed. She had such problems in her marriage. All I was doing was listening. What was I supposed to do? Just let her feel so alone, right? And you can you can create a compelling rationale, the world of kindness and compassion, that the one thing led to another, but I was just really trying to keep her afloat, to try to give her, this little girl, some love when she didn't feel love in her marriage. How many stories of adulterers would that tell you? And in a way, a father can be guilty of that too, right? And sometimes the boundary of adultery is like, look, there's a sacred relationship here, and people have got to work out that sacred relationship on their own terms. And the boundaries keeping you out are very serious.
Right. That's what's sort of shocking to me, is that from good and from love, like you can commit a crime in love, you can hurt people that way, and you can corrupt your most intimate relationships.
Fascinating.
As we were finishing up for the day, I was really struck by what we had uncovered. Not just the continuation of the parallels between the Ten Commandments and the fallout of the deception story, but the way this was transforming how we read the commandments. There's a temptation to read this commentary of Genesis 27, the extended Yaakov story onto the Ten Commandments. It's tempting to read that as like a morality lessons, right? Esav didn't murder, so Taka, you shouldn't murder. And then, continues like, you see this business with the Neof, and you shouldn't do that. And also stealing is bad, right? Like, it's funny because the Ten Commandments themselves can read very dry and moralistic. You don't need extra, content to moralize at people. What's fascinating is that each one of these we're seeing is a story of people thinking that they're going to get what they want, and they won't. Like, look at the not killing of Esav, right? If what we're seeing over and over is that Esav beef with Yaakov wasn't about Yaakov, it's about dad. So if he kills Yaakov, right, he's not going to get what he actually wanted anyways.
And similarly in Neof also, right? You think that maybe if you have this affair, you're going to find the love that's missing in your life. What you're really going to do is cause all three relationships to completely break apart, and whatever love you had is going to melt away, right? So you think you're going to have it? No, you're going to destroy it.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah. It is. And you see it from the commentary of the Yaakov story, I think.
So it's not just about morality, right? This is not about like shoulds and shouldn'ts and like hold yourself back from doing the wrong thing. This isn't scolding. This is actually, it's in some sense, the Torah is unfolding as a guidebook.
Right. You can't get I understand what you want. I understand why you want it. I really understand why you might want to murder that guy who completely looks like he is your nemesis, and he did you in and destroyed your relationship with Father. I get how from your perspective you would want to murder him. You can't get what you want that way. And it's a disaster. Yeah.
To me, this is more nourishing than mere morality, right? Because this actually, it's not about do's and don'ts. It's about actually like healing something within you. When you read these two stories together and you say, okay, when do I covet, or when do I, want to steal, or when do I, right? Just understand you'll never get what you want that way. And that brings us to the end of Commandment 7. But we've still got 3 more left, and we'll get into the next 2 of those, don't steal and don't bear false witness, next time. See you then. So you may have heard me say that this podcast is a product of Aleph Beta, and I just want to take the time to tell you what Aleph Beta is. Aleph Beta is a Torah media company, but the truth is that it was founded around the work of Rabbi David Fohrman, who is pioneering, I think, a way of interpreting Torah text that is pretty incredible. It's been transformative in my life and incredibly healing, actually. Rabbi Fohrman believes that the Torah is truly a book like no other, in that it has incredible beauty. It's got all sorts of patterns and mystery to it. From those patterns and from that incredible depth of text, meaning emerges, deep insights into what it means to be a human being, deep insights into how to be in relationship with your loved ones, with God. Now, we have a library filled with thousands of videos and audios, and many people really enjoy our Parsha and our holiday content. But if you really want to get what we mean when we say that this truly is a book like no other and it's filled with rich wisdom, then I invite you to come check out our library. Come, wade into the deeper end of the pool. You can actually try out Right now, a 7-day free trial with no commitment, and after that, a small membership fee gives you access to the entire library. And membership, by the way, is the best way to support everything we do. So if you really love what we're doing and you want to support it, it would mean the world to us. I hope you'll check us out. There's a link in the description below.